A black man named John is arrested while grocery shopping, but when the cops find out who his dad is, everything changes in an instant. What would happen next after this life-changing incident? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. John Carter, a black middle-aged man in his 40s, glanced at his watch as he shut down his computer for the day. A small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Another day done, and now it was time for his favorite part of the afternoon, a quiet trip to the grocery store. As he stepped out of his office building, the warm afternoon sun caressed his face. John took a deep breath, savoring the fresh air after hours cooped up inside. He walked to his car, a dependable sedan that had seen better days but still got him where he needed to go. The drive to Walmart was short and familiar. John hummed along to an old jazz tune on the radio, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. He pulled into the parking lot and grabbed a cart, its wheels squeaking slightly as he pushed it through the automatic doors. Inside, the cool air and soft music welcomed him. John moved slowly down the aisles, carefully checking his list. He picked up a loaf of whole wheat bread, some fresh vegetables, and a carton of milk. As he reached for a can of soup, he noticed an elderly woman struggling to grab something from a high shelf. "Excuse me, ma'am," John said softly. "May I help you with that?" The woman turned, her wrinkled face lighting up with gratitude. "Oh, thank you, young man. These old bones just aren't what they used to be." John smiled warmly and easily retrieved the item she wanted. As he handed it to her, he felt a small glow of satisfaction. It was moments like these that made him feel connected to his community. Finishing his shopping, John made his way to the checkout. The young cashier greeted him by name. He'd been coming here so long, most of the staff knew him. They exchanged pleasant small talk as she rang up his items. As John loaded the grocery bags into his car, he felt content. This was his life, simple, predictable, and peaceful. He had no idea that in just a few short hours, everything he knew about himself and his world would be turned upside down. John walked leisurely through his neighborhood, grocery bags in hand. The evening air was cool and refreshing, a welcome change from the stuffy office. He breathed deeply, enjoying the scent of blooming flowers from nearby gardens. As he strolled, John's mind wandered to his mother. He made a mental note to call her later, picturing her warm smile and hearing her gentle voice in his mind. I should ask about her garden club meeting, he thought, knowing how much joy it brought her. The peaceful quiet of the residential street was broken only by the chirping of birds and the distant laughter of children playing. John nodded politely to a neighbor watering their lawn, feeling grateful for the sense of community in his little corner of the world. Just as he turned the corner onto his street, the tranquil atmosphere shattered. The sudden wail of police sirens pierced the air, growing louder by the second. John's heart rate spiked, his peaceful mood evaporating in an instant. Before he could fully process what was happening, several police cars screeched to a halt around him, their tires squealing against the pavement. John froze in shock, his grocery bags slipping from his grasp and hitting the sidewalk with a thud. Officers leaped out of their vehicles, moving with alarming speed and precision. John's eyes widened in disbelief as he found himself staring down the barrels of multiple guns, all pointed directly at him. "Don't move," an officer shouted, his voice harsh and commanding. "Put your hands where we can see them." John's mind raced, confusion and fear battling for dominance. His hands trembled as he slowly raised them, palms out, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. The grocery items lay scattered at his feet, a stark reminder of the ordinary errand that had somehow led to this terrifying moment. "What's happening?" John managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. But his question was met with more shouts and the ominous sound of guns being cocked. The officers surrounded John, their weapons still trained on him. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. One officer, a stern-faced man, stepped forward. "John Carter?" he barked, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. John nodded slowly. "Yes, that's me. What's going on?" The officer's face hardened. "Don't play dumb with us. We know what you did." Confusion washed over John. I'm sorry, but I don't understand. What do you think I did? Another officer, a younger woman with a tight ponytail, chimed in. There was a robbery at the convenience store 2 blocks from here. Witnesses described the suspect as a middle-aged black man named John. That's you, isn't it? John's eyes widened in disbelief. No, there must be some mistake. I've been at work all day. I just finished grocery shopping. He gestured to the scattered items on the ground. The first officer scoffed. A likely story. We've got eyewitnesses, pal. You match the description perfectly. John took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. Officers, I assure you, I had nothing to do with any robbery. I'm a law-abiding citizen. There has to be a misunderstanding. But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The officers exchanged skeptical glances, their weapons still pointed at John. Save it for the station, the female officer snapped. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. John's mind raced. He knew he was innocent, but the officers weren't listening. Slowly, he turned around, his heart heavy with the injustice of the situation. As one of the officers approached with handcuffs, John made one last attempt to reason with them. Please, can we just talk about this? I can prove I was at work. My boss can vouch for me. The officer with the mustache grabbed John's arm roughly. I said save it. You have the right to remain silent. Use it. As the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, John felt a mix of fear and frustration wash over him. He had always respected the law, but now he found himself caught in its unforgiving grip, a victim of mistaken identity and hasty judgment. The officers roughly pushed John to the ground, forcing him onto his stomach. The cold pavement pressed against his cheek as they tightened the handcuffs around his wrists. John winced at the discomfort but remained silent, his mind racing with confusion and fear. As the scene unfolded, neighbors began to gather on the sidewalks. Some peered out from behind curtains, while others stood on their front porches, whispering to one another. The crowd grew larger by the minute, their faces a mix of shock and concern. Mrs. Thompson, John's elderly neighbor, gasped and clutched her chest. "That's John Carter," she exclaimed. "He's such a nice young man. There must be some mistake." John could hear the murmurs of the onlookers, their voices a blend of disbelief and sympathy. He felt a deep sense of humiliation wash over him as he lay there, exposed and vulnerable in front of people who knew him as a quiet, kind-hearted member of the community. Despite the turmoil inside him, John managed to maintain his composure. He took slow, deep breaths, trying to calm his racing heart. He knew that losing control would only make the situation worse. One of the officers knelt beside John, roughly patting him down. "Where's the money, Carter?" he demanded. "We know you took it." John's voice was steady as he replied, "Sir, I didn't take any money. This is all a misunderstanding. Please, if you just listen." "Shut it," the officer snapped, pressing John's face harder against the pavement. As John lay there, he could feel the eyes of his neighbors on him. He thought about his mother and how worried she would be if she saw him like this. The fear and confusion in his heart mingled with a growing sense of injustice. The crowd continued to grow, with some people pulling out their phones to record the incident. John could hear snippets of their conversations. "That's John from number 42, isn't it?" "Yeah, he always helps me with my groceries." "This can't be right. John wouldn't hurt a fly." The police officers roughly hauled John to his feet and led him to a waiting patrol car. As they pushed him into the back seat, John caught a glimpse of his neighbors' worried faces. The car door slammed shut, and John felt his heart sink as they drove away from his quiet neighborhood. The ride to the police station was a blur of flashing lights and wailing sirens. John sat in silence, his mind reeling from the sudden turn of events. He couldn't shake the image of his neighbors watching him being arrested like a common criminal. At the station, the officers marched John through a series of cold, sterile hallways. The harsh fluorescent lights made him squint, and the smell of disinfectant filled his nostrils. They stopped at a desk where a stern-faced officer sat, ready to process him. "Name?" the officer asked gruffly. "John Carter," John replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. As the officer typed his information into the computer, John spoke up. "Sir, I need to tell you that there's been a terrible mistake. I didn't rob anyone. I was just walking home from the grocery store." The officer barely glanced up. "Save it for the detective, buddy." John felt a wave of frustration wash over him, but he bit his tongue. He knew losing his cool wouldn't help his situation. As they took his fingerprints and snapped his mugshot, John couldn't believe this was really happening to him. Standing against the wall for his photo, John thought about his mother. What would she say when she found out? The flash of the camera momentarily blinded him, and he blinked away tears of disbelief. As they led him to a holding cell, John's mind raced. How had his ordinary day turned into this nightmare? Just hours ago, he'd been at work thinking about what to make for dinner. Now he was being treated like a dangerous criminal. Despite his growing anxiety, John remained cooperative. He answered questions calmly and respectfully, clinging to the hope that the truth would soon come out. But as the metal door of the holding cell clanged shut behind him, John couldn't help but wonder how long it would take for his innocence to be proven. As John sat in the holding cell, his mind racing with worry and confusion, he heard a commotion outside. Suddenly, the door swung open, and one of the officers who had arrested him appeared, looking flustered. "Mr. Carter, please come with me," the officer said, his tone noticeably softer than before. John stood up slowly, his legs stiff from sitting on the hard bench. He followed the officer out of the cell, wondering what was happening now. They walked into a small office where several other officers were gathered, including the chief of police. The atmosphere in the room was tense, and John could sense something had changed. The chief stepped forward, his face a mixture of embarrassment and regret. "Mr. Carter, we owe you a sincere apology. There's been a grave misunderstanding." John's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" The chief took a deep breath. "We've run your identification, and it's clear that you're not the man we were looking for. But more than that, we've discovered something about your family that we weren't aware of." John's heart began to race. What could they possibly have found out? "Mr. Carter," the chief continued, his voice filled with awe, "are you aware that your father was Reverend James Carter?" John's eyes widened in shock. He had never known his father, and his mother rarely spoke of him. I didn't know my father's name," he stammered. The officers in the room exchanged glances of disbelief. One of them spoke up, his voice trembling slightly. "Reverend James Carter was a renowned civil rights leader. He dedicated his life to fighting for equality and justice." John felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. All these years he had wondered about his father, and now, in this most unlikely of circumstances, he was learning about his incredible legacy. The chief's face was etched with shame. "Mr. Carter, we cannot begin to express how sorry we are for this terrible mistake. Not only have we wrongly accused an innocent man, but we've also disrespected the son of a great leader who fought against the very injustices you've experienced today." As John tried to process the shocking revelation about his father, the station door burst open. Martha Carter, John's mother, stormed in, her eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and anger. "Where is my son?" she demanded, her voice echoing through the station. The chief quickly stepped forward. "Mrs. Carter, I presume. Your son is right here. We were just explaining." Martha rushed past him, enveloping John in a tight embrace. "Oh, John, are you all right? I came as soon as I heard." John hugged his mother back, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. "I'm okay, Mom, but I'm so confused. They just told me about Dad." Martha pulled back, her eyes filled with concern and a hint of guilt. She turned to face the officers, her expression hardening. "How dare you treat my son this way? Do you have any idea what you've done?" The chief stepped forward, his head bowed. "Mrs. Carter, we deeply regret our actions. We've made a terrible mistake." "A mistake?" Martha's voice trembled with anger. "You arrested my son without cause, humiliated him in public, and now you call it a mistake?" The officers shifted uncomfortably, the weight of their error settling heavily upon them. Martha's presence seemed to fill the room, her indignation palpable. "Mom," John said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "They know who Dad was. They told me he was a civil rights leader." Martha's eyes softened as she looked at her son. "Oh, John, I'm so sorry. I should have told you long ago. I thought I was protecting you, but..." The chief cleared his throat. Mrs. Carter, we understand now the gravity of our actions. Not only have we wrongly accused your son, but we've also dishonored the legacy of Reverend James Carter. Martha turned back to the officers, her voice steady and firm. What happened here today is exactly what my husband fought against. He believed in justice and equality for all, and yet decades later, his own son is treated like a criminal because of the color of his skin. The police chief's face fell as he listened to Martha's words. He looked at John, then back at Martha, his eyes filled with shame. Mrs. Carter, Mr. Carter, I cannot express how deeply sorry we are, he said, his voice heavy with regret. We've made a terrible mistake, and there's no excuse for our actions. John stood quietly, still processing everything that had happened. He felt a mix of emotions, relief at being cleared, confusion about his father's identity, and a deep sense of injustice at how he'd been treated. One of the officers stepped forward, holding John's grocery receipt. Sir, we've confirmed that you were at the store during the time of the robbery. This receipt proves your alibi. Martha squeezed John's hand, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Of course he was. My son is an honest man, just like his father. The chief nodded solemnly. We're releasing you immediately, Mr. Carter. Again, we're deeply sorry for this ordeal. As an officer removed John's handcuffs, the reality of the situation truly sank in. John rubbed his wrists, looking around at the ashamed faces of the police officers. I accept your apology, John said quietly, his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt inside. But this isn't right. What if I hadn't had that receipt? What if my mother couldn't come to vouch for me? The officers shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet John's gaze. The chief stepped forward again, his voice filled with genuine remorse. Mr. Carter, you're absolutely right. Our actions were inexcusable. We jumped to conclusions based on prejudices we shouldn't have. We've dishonored your father's legacy and everything he fought for. John nodded, still trying to wrap his head around this new information about his father. He felt a deep sadness, not just for himself, but for all those who might have faced similar situations without the means to prove their innocence. As John and Martha prepared to leave the station, the weight of the experience settled heavily on John's shoulders. He was free to go, but the memory of being handcuffed, accused, and treated like a criminal would not fade easily. The trust he once had in the system had been shaken to its core. As John and Martha stepped out of the police station, the cool evening air hit their faces. John took a deep breath, trying to clear his mind of the chaos that had just unfolded. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Martha gently touched her son's arm. Let's go home, John. We have a lot to talk about. John nodded silently, his mind swirling with questions. They walked to Martha's car in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. As they drove through the quiet streets, John stared out the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. Finally, he turned to his mother. Mom, why didn't you ever tell me about Dad? About who he really was? Martha's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She took a deep breath, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Oh, John, I wanted to protect you. Your father was an amazing man, but his work came with risks. I thought if you didn't know, you'd be safer. John felt a mix of emotions wash over him, confusion, hurt, and a strange sense of loss for a father he never truly knew. But Mom, all these years, I had a right to know. Martha nodded, her voice thick with emotion. You're right, honey, I see that now. I was so afraid of losing you like I lost your father, but keeping this secret, it wasn't fair to you. As they pulled up to John's house, Martha turned off the engine. The silence in the car was deafening. John stared at his hands, trying to process everything. Tell me about him, Mom, John said softly. Tell me about Dad. Martha reached out and took her son's hand. Your father, Reverend James Carter, was a brave and compassionate man. He fought for what was right, even when it was dangerous. He believed in justice and equality for all people. John listened intently, his heart aching for the father he never knew, and the legacy he'd been unaware of for so long. As Martha spoke, John began to see pieces of himself in the description of his father, the calm demeanor, the strong sense of right and wrong, the desire to help others. John and Martha entered his modest home, the familiar surroundings a stark contrast to the turmoil of the day. John flicked on the lights, illuminating the living room where so many quiet evenings had passed. Now it would be the setting for a conversation that would change everything. "Let's sit down, Mom," John said softly, gesturing to the worn but comfortable couch. Martha nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. As they settled onto the couch, John turned to face his mother, his heart heavy with questions. "Mom," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "why didn't you ever tell me about Dad? About who he really was?" Martha's hands trembled in her lap. She took a deep breath, her voice quivering as she spoke. "Oh, John, I wanted to protect you. Your father was an incredible man, but his work, it came with dangers. I thought if you didn't know, you'd be safer." John felt a pang of hurt mixed with understanding. "But all these years, Mom, I had a right to know about my own father." Tears spilled down Martha's cheeks. "You're right, honey. I see that now. I was so scared of losing you like I lost your father. The thought of you facing the same risks, the same burdens, it terrified me." John reached out and took his mother's hand, squeezing it gently. "Tell me everything, Mom. I need to know." Martha nodded, wiping her eyes with her free hand. "Your father, Reverend James Carter, was a man of great courage and conviction. He fought for civil rights, for justice and equality. But his work made him a target. There were threats, dangers." As Martha spoke, her voice grew stronger, filled with love and pride for the man she had lost. "When you were born, John, your father and I made a decision. We wanted to give you a chance at a normal life, free from the shadow of his legacy. When he died, I decided to keep that promise." John listened intently, his heart aching for the father he never truly knew, and the mother who had carried this burden alone for so long. He could see the love and pain in his mother's eyes, the years of sacrifice etched in the lines of her face. "I'm so sorry, John," Martha said, her voice breaking. "I thought I was doing what was best for you, but I see now that I was wrong to keep this from you. Can you forgive me?" Martha took a deep breath, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow, as she began to recount the story of James Carter. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, painting a vivid picture of the man John had never truly known. "Your father was a man of incredible courage and compassion, John," Martha began. "He dedicated his life to fighting for justice and equality. He believed that love could conquer hate, and he lived by that principle every single day." John listened intently, his heart swelling with a newfound admiration for the father he'd never known. Martha continued, her voice filled with emotion. "James organized peaceful protests, spoke at rallies, and worked tirelessly to bring people together. He became a voice for those who had been silenced, a beacon of hope in dark times." She paused, her eyes distant as she recalled those tumultuous years. "But with that came a price, John. Your father's work made him a public figure, and that placed an enormous burden on our family. There were constant demands on his time, threats from those who opposed his message, and the weight of so many people's hopes and dreams on his shoulders." John could see the toll these memories were taking on his mother. He squeezed her hand gently, encouraging her to continue. "When you were born," Martha said, her voice softening, "we saw a chance for something different. We wanted you to have a normal life, free from the expectations and dangers that came with being James Carter's son. We didn't want you to feel the pressure of living up to his legacy or to be a target for those who still held on to hate." Tears welled up in Martha's eyes as she looked at her son. "After your father passed, I decided to honor our wish for you to have a life of your own. I wanted you to be John Carter, not just Reverend James Carter's son. I wanted you to find your own path, make your own choices without the weight of your father's name on your shoulders." John listened with rapt attention as Martha shared stories of his father's bravery and the challenges their family faced. His heart swelled with a mix of pride and sadness as he learned about the man he had never known. "There was this one time," Martha said, her eyes shining with unshed tears, "when your father stood up to a group of angry men who wanted to stop a peaceful protest. He didn't back down, even when they threatened him. He just looked them in the eye and said, 'Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that.'" John felt a lump form in his throat. He could almost see his father standing tall and brave in the face of danger. Martha continued, her voice soft but steady. "But it wasn't easy, John. We got threatening phone calls in the middle of the night. Sometimes people would throw rocks at our windows. Your father would stay up all night making sure we were safe." As John listened, he began to understand the weight his father had carried. The constant worry, the sleepless nights, the fear for his family's safety, it all painted a picture of a man who sacrificed so much for what he believed in. "Your father missed so many family dinners, so many of your first milestones," Martha said, her voice tinged with regret. "He was out there fighting for a better world, but it came at a cost to our family." John nodded, feeling a newfound respect for both his parents. He realized that his mother's decision to keep this from him was born out of love and a desire to protect him. "But you know what?" Martha said, a small smile breaking through her tears. "Your father never lost hope. No matter how hard things got, he always believed that love would win in the end. He used to say, 'The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice.'" As Martha shared more stories, John began to see his father in a new light. He wasn't just a distant figure or a name in history books. James Carter was a real man, flawed but courageous, who had fought tirelessly for what he believed in. John felt a mix of admiration for his father's strength and sadness for the relationship they never had. As Martha's stories came to an end, John sat in silence for a moment, his mind swirling with a mix of emotions. Pride swelled in his chest at the thought of his father's courageous work, but it was quickly followed by a wave of confusion and hurt. He looked at his mother, his eyes searching for answers. "Mom," John said softly, his voice trembling slightly, "I understand why Dad did what he did, but why? Why did you keep all this from me? Why didn't you tell me who he was?" Martha sighed deeply, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her long-held secret. She reached out and took John's hand in hers, her touch gentle and comforting. "Oh, John," she said, her voice filled with love and a hint of regret. "I wanted you to have the chance to be your own person, to forge your own path without the pressure of living up to your father's name." John listened intently as Martha continued. "Your father was an incredible man, but his work came with a heavy burden. People expected so much from him, and I saw how it wore him down. I didn't want that for you, sweetheart." Tears welled up in Martha's eyes as she spoke. "I wanted you to have the freedom to choose your own destiny, to make your own mark on the world without feeling like you had to fill your father's shoes." John felt a lump form in his throat as he began to understand the depth of his mother's love and the difficult choice she had made. "But don't you think I had a right to know?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "To make that choice for myself?" Martha nodded slowly, her eyes filled with understanding. "You're right, John. Maybe I was wrong to keep it from you for so long. I was just trying to protect you, to give you a chance at a normal life. But I see now that in trying to shield you, I might have taken something important away from you." Martha's words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. John sat quietly, his mind racing as he tried to process everything he had learned. The weight of his father's legacy pressed down on him, and he found himself wondering how different his life might have been if he had known about Reverend James Carter sooner. "I can't help but think about all the things I might have done differently," John said softly, his eyes distant. "All the choices I might have made if I had known." Martha reached out and squeezed her son's hand. "John, you've become an amazing man all on your own. Your kindness, your integrity, those are all you. Your father would be so proud of the person you've become." John nodded, but the conflict still showed on his face. "I know, Mom, but I can't help feeling like I've missed out on something important. Like maybe I could have done more, been more, if I had known about Dad's work." Martha's eyes filled with understanding. "Oh, sweetheart, I made the best decision I could at the time. I wanted you to have the freedom to choose your own path without feeling the pressure of your father's name." As John listened to his mother's words, he began to grapple with the idea that his life had been shaped by forces he never fully understood. The quiet, simple life he had always known suddenly seemed like a carefully constructed facade, built to protect him from a legacy he hadn't even known existed. "I guess I'm just trying to figure out where I fit in all of this now," John admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who am I supposed to be?" Martha smiled gently at her son. "You're still you, John. This doesn't change who you are at your core. It just gives you a new perspective on where you came from." John nodded slowly, beginning to understand the complexity of his mother's decision. He realized that his life, while different from what it might have been, was still uniquely his own. Over the next few days, John found himself lost in thought, his mind constantly returning to the conversation with his mother and the shocking revelation about his father. He spent hours sitting in his favorite armchair, staring out the window at the quiet neighborhood he had always called home, seeing it now through new eyes. The memory of his arrest still stung, the feeling of cold handcuffs on his wrists and the harsh glares of the officers etched into his mind. But now, with the knowledge of his father's legacy, John began to see the incident in a different light. He wondered how things might have unfolded if he had known about his father's work in civil rights. Would the officers have treated him differently if they had known who he was from the start? As he mulled over these thoughts, John felt a mix of emotions swirling within him. Pride in his father's accomplishments battled with a sense of loss for the relationship they never had. Anger at the injustice he had faced competed with a growing understanding of the complexities of the world his father had fought to change. John found himself at a crossroads. He could let the weight of his father's legacy and the recent injustice he had faced define him, shaping his future in ways he had never anticipated. Or he could choose to forge his own path, honoring his father's memory while staying true to the person he had become. As the days passed, John realized that this choice was not just about him. It was about the kind of impact he wanted to have on the world around him. He thought about the quiet life he had led, the small kindnesses he had shown to his neighbors and co-workers. While these actions might have seemed insignificant before, John now saw them in a new light, as small but meaningful ways of continuing his father's work of spreading love and justice. John decided it was time to learn more about his father's work. With a sense of purpose, he made his way to the local library, a place he had visited countless times before, but now saw with new eyes. As he walked through the familiar doors, the smell of old books and the quiet hush of the library enveloped him. He approached the librarian, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Johnson, who had known John for years. "I'm looking for information about Reverend James Carter," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Johnson's eyes widened in recognition and she nodded knowingly. "Follow me," she said, leading John to a section of the library he had never paid much attention to before. She pulled out several dusty volumes of old newspapers and pointed him towards the microfiche machine. "You'll find a lot about him in these," she said with a gentle smile. John spent hours poring over the old articles, his heart swelling with each new piece of information he uncovered. He read about his father's impassioned speeches, the peaceful protests he organized, and the positive changes he helped bring about in their community. The words on the pages painted a picture of a man who was brave, compassionate, and deeply committed to making the world a better place. As he read, John felt a mix of emotions wash over him. Pride in his father's accomplishments mingled with a sense of loss for the relationship they never had. But above all, he felt inspired. The more he learned about Reverend James Carter's dedication to justice and equality, the more John felt a growing desire to carry on his father's legacy. Yet John knew he couldn't simply try to be a carbon copy of his father. He wasn't a fiery orator or a natural-born leader. But as he reflected on his own life, his quiet kindness, his ability to listen and empathize with others, John began to see how he could honor his father's memory in his own unique way. John felt a deep need to connect with his father's past. With trembling hands, he dialed the number of Reverend Michael Martinez, one of his father's closest friends and colleagues. The phone rang twice before a warm, deep voice answered. "Hello?" Reverend Martinez said. "Hello, Reverend Martinez. This is John Carter, James Carter's son," John replied, his voice wavering slightly. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "John? My goodness, it's been years. How are you, son?" John swallowed hard. "I'm doing all right, sir. I was wondering if we could meet. I'd like to hear about my father, if you're willing to share." Reverend Martinez agreed without hesitation, and they arranged to meet at a local coffee shop the next day. As John entered the cozy cafe, he spotted an elderly man with kind eyes sitting at a corner table. Reverend Martinez stood up and embraced John warmly. "You look just like your father," he said, his eyes misty with emotion. They sat down, and Reverend Martinez began to share his memories. He spoke of James's unwavering commitment to justice, his infectious laugh, and his ability to inspire hope in even the darkest times. "Your father had a way of making everyone feel heard," Reverend Martinez said, his voice filled with admiration. He believed that real change came from understanding one another. John listened intently, hanging on every word. He learned about the challenges his father faced, the threats he received, and the countless lives he touched. "There was this one time," Reverend Martinez continued, leaning in closer, "when your father organized a sit-in at a local diner. Things were getting tense, but James stood up and started singing 'We Shall Overcome.' Soon, everyone joined in. It was powerful, John. Your father had a way of bringing people together, even in the face of hatred." As John absorbed these stories, he felt a mix of emotions: pride, sorrow for the father he never knew, and a growing sense of purpose. He began to see how his own quiet strength and compassion could be used to continue his father's work in his own way. Inspired by the stories of his father's courage and compassion, John felt a stirring in his heart. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future. With newfound purpose, John decided to reach out to the local youth center, hoping to make a difference in his community. The next day, John nervously approached the worn-down building of the Oakwood Youth Center. As he stepped inside, the sound of children laughing and playing filled his ears. A kind-faced woman greeted him with a warm smile. "Hi there, I'm Sarah. Can I help you?" she asked. John took a deep breath. "Hello, I'm John Carter. I was hoping to volunteer here, maybe mentor some of the kids?" Sarah's eyes lit up. "Oh, that would be wonderful. We're always in need of good role models for our youth." As John filled out the necessary paperwork, he couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and anxiety. He wondered if he had what it took to make a real difference in these young lives. Over the next few weeks, John spent his evenings at the youth center. He helped kids with their homework, played basketball with them, and most importantly, listened to their stories. John found himself sharing bits of wisdom he had gleaned from learning about his father's life. One day, while helping a young boy named Marcus with his math homework, John noticed the child seemed distracted. "Everything okay, Marcus?" John asked gently. Marcus hesitated before speaking. "Mr. John, how do you stay strong when people are mean to you?" John's heart ached, remembering his own recent experience with injustice. He thought carefully before answering. "You know, Marcus, my father once said that strength isn't about fighting back. It's about standing tall and treating others with kindness, even when they don't deserve it." Marcus looked up at John, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Your dad sounds smart. Was he a teacher too?" John smiled softly. "No, but he was a great leader who fought for what was right. And you know what? I think you can be a leader too, Marcus. By being kind and standing up for others, you can make a big difference." As the weeks passed, John saw the impact of his words and actions. The kids at the center began to open up more, sharing their dreams and fears. John felt a sense of fulfillment he had never experienced before. He realized that by helping these young people, he was not only honoring his father's legacy, but also finding his own path to make the world a little bit better. As John continued his work at the youth center, he couldn't shake the memory of his wrongful arrest. The fear and humiliation he felt that day lingered, but now it was mixed with a sense of purpose. He realized that his experience wasn't unique, and many in his community had faced similar injustices. One evening, after finishing up at the center, John decided to take action. He reached out to his mother, Martha, for advice. "Mom, I can't just sit by and let what happened to me keep happening to others," John said, his voice filled with determination. Martha smiled proudly at her son. "You sound just like your father, John. He always said that change starts with one person speaking up." Encouraged by his mother's words, John began to share his story. He started small, talking to the parents at the youth center about his experience. Many were shocked to hear what had happened to him, and they shared their own stories of encounters with the police. Realizing the depth of the issue, John decided to take his message further. He reached out to local community leaders and organized a town hall meeting to discuss police-community relations. The turnout was larger than he expected, with concerned citizens, police officers, and local officials all in attendance. John stood at the podium, his heart racing. He took a deep breath and began to speak. "I stand before you not as a victim but as a member of this community who believes we can do better," John said, his voice steady and clear. "We need to build bridges of understanding between our police force and our neighborhoods. It's not about pointing fingers, but about working together to create a safer, more just community for all of us." His words resonated with the audience. People nodded in agreement, and a respectful silence filled the room as John shared his vision for improved police training, community outreach programs, and open dialogue between law enforcement and residents. As John finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. Several community leaders approached him, eager to support his ideas. Even a few police officers came forward, expressing their desire to be part of the solution. In the days following the town hall meeting, John received an unexpected call. It was Officer Thompson, one of the policemen who had arrested him. The officer's voice was filled with remorse as he spoke. "Mr. Carter, we need to talk to you," Officer Thompson said, his voice shaky. "Can we meet?" John agreed, and the next day he found himself face to face with Officer Thompson and his partner, Officer Rodriguez, at a local coffee shop. The officers looked uncomfortable, their eyes downcast as John approached. "Mr. Carter," Officer Thompson began, "we can't express how sorry we are for what happened. We made a terrible mistake, and we know we hurt you deeply." Officer Rodriguez nodded, adding, "We've been doing a lot of thinking since that day. We want to make things right, but we don't know how. Is there anything we can do?" John studied their faces, seeing genuine regret in their eyes. He thought about his father's legacy of forgiveness and reconciliation. Taking a deep breath, he made a decision that would change all their lives. "Actually, there is something you can do," John said, his voice calm and steady. "I've been working on community initiatives to bridge the gap between police and residents. I'd like you both to join me in this work." The officers looked at each other, surprised by John's offer. They had expected anger, not an invitation to help. "Are you sure?" Officer Thompson asked. "After what we did?" John nodded. "This is how we make real change, by working together, learning from each other, and building trust." Over the next few weeks, John and the officers began collaborating on various projects. They organized community basketball games where kids could interact with police officers in a fun, relaxed setting. They set up a mentoring program pairing officers with at-risk youth. As they worked side by side, the officers gained a new perspective on the community they served. They saw the impact of their actions and learned to approach their job with more empathy and understanding. As word spread about John's work at the youth center and his collaboration with the police officers, more people in the community began to take notice. The once quiet center started buzzing with activity, becoming a beacon of hope and positive change. John's dedication was infectious. He spent his evenings and weekends at the center, sharing stories about his father's legacy and teaching the kids about compassion, perseverance, and the importance of standing up for what's right. The children hung on his every word, their eyes wide with wonder as they learned about the civil rights movement and the power of peaceful protest. Soon, other community members started volunteering their time. Mrs. Johnson, a retired teacher, offered to tutor kids after school. Mr. Ramirez, the local mechanic, taught basic car maintenance to interested teens. Even Martha, John's mother, got involved, sharing her wisdom and baking treats for the center's events. The impact of John's efforts rippled through the neighborhood. Crime rates started to drop, and there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. People began to greet each other on the streets, and neighbors looked out for one another. One sunny Saturday, John organized a community cleanup day. To his amazement, over 100 people showed up, including families, business owners, and even some of the local politicians. They worked together, picking up trash, planting flowers, and repainting old buildings. As John watched the diverse group of people working side by side, he felt a warmth in his chest. This was what his father had fought for: unity, respect, and a sense of shared purpose. He realized that he was carrying on his father's legacy in his own unique way, not through grand speeches or marches, but through small, everyday acts of kindness and community building. The youth center became more than just a place for kids to hang out after school. It transformed into a hub for positive change, where people of all ages came together to learn, grow, and support one another. John found himself at the center of it all, leading by example and inspiring others to get involved. As John continued his work at the youth center, he felt a growing sense of connection to his father. Each day, as he interacted with the kids and community members, he saw glimpses of the impact his father must have had on people's lives. It wasn't just in the stories he'd heard or the articles he'd read. It was in the way people's eyes lit up when they talked about hope and change. One evening, after a particularly rewarding day at the center, John sat alone in the quiet room. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. For the first time, he truly felt his father's presence within him. It wasn't a ghostly apparition or a booming voice from the heavens, but a gentle, comforting feeling that seemed to say, "You're on the right path, son." John opened his eyes, a smile playing on his lips. He realized that although he had never known James personally, he carried his father's spirit within him. It was in his patience when dealing with troubled teens, in his determination to make the community better, and in his unwavering belief in the goodness of people. This realization brought John a sense of peace and fulfillment that he hadn't felt before. The void he'd always sensed, the missing piece of his identity, was finally filled. He wasn't just John Carter anymore. He was John Carter, son of Reverend James Carter, carrying on a legacy of love, justice, and community service in his own unique way. With this newfound sense of purpose, John became even more committed to making a difference. He approached each day at the center with renewed energy and passion. The kids noticed the change in him too. They saw a man who was not just going through the motions, but someone who truly believed in the power of their actions to change the world. As the days passed, John found himself spending more time with his mother, Martha. Their conversations, once filled with everyday chatter, now delved deeper into the past, exploring the rich tapestry of James Carter's life and the choices that had shaped their family. One warm evening, they sat on the porch swing, the gentle creaking of the chains, a soothing backdrop to their talk. Martha's eyes sparkled as she recounted a story of James's early days as a young preacher. "Your father had such a way with words," she said, her voice soft with memory. "He could make people believe in themselves, in each other. It was like magic." John listened intently, his heart swelling with pride. "I wish I could have known him," he said, a hint of sadness in his voice. Martha reached out and took his hand. "Oh, John, you do know him. I see so much of James in you every day. Your kindness, your strength, your desire to help others. That's all him." John squeezed her hand, feeling a lump form in his throat. "Mom, I want you to know. I understand why you kept all this from me. I know it couldn't have been easy." Martha's eyes welled up with tears. "I was so afraid, John. Afraid of the burden it might place on you, afraid of losing you to the same dangers that took your father. But watching you now, seeing the man you've become, I'm so proud of you." John felt his own eyes grow misty. "Thank you, Mom, for everything. For loving me. For protecting me. For sacrificing so much. I wouldn't be who I am without you." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history settling around them like a warm blanket. John realized that this new openness between them was healing old wounds he hadn't even known existed. "Tell me more about Dad," John said, leaning back on the swing. "I want to know everything." Martha smiled, her face glowing with love for both her son and the memory of her husband. As she began another story, John felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. He knew that together, he and his mother were not just healing from the past, but building a stronger bond for the future. As the community outreach programs began to take shape, John found himself working closely with the very officers who had wronged him. Officer Davis and Officer Thompson, once the faces of injustice in John's eyes, now stood beside him as allies in his mission to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. At first, their presence at community events was met with skepticism and even hostility. Whispers and sideways glances followed them as they helped set up chairs for town hall meetings or handed out flyers for youth programs. "Why are they here?" John overheard an elderly woman ask at one of the first meetings. "After what they did to you, John, how can you trust them?" John took a deep breath and addressed the room. "I know many of you have doubts," he said, his voice steady and calm. "But if we want real change, we need to be willing to forgive and give second chances. Officer Davis and Officer Thompson are here because they want to make things right." The officers stood nervously at the back of the room, their faces a mixture of shame and determination. Officer Davis stepped forward, his voice shaky but sincere. "We made a terrible mistake," he admitted. "But we're here to learn, to listen, and to do better. We hope you'll give us that chance." Over the weeks that followed, the officers threw themselves into the community work. They volunteered at the youth center, participated in neighborhood cleanup days, and even organized a series of Coffee with a Cop events to encourage open dialogue with residents. Slowly but surely, the community's attitude began to shift. People who had once crossed the street to avoid the officers now stopped to chat. Children who had been taught to fear the police started to see them as helpers and protectors. One day, as John and Officer Thompson were painting a mural at the community center, a young boy approached them. "Can I help?" he asked shyly. Officer Thompson smiled and handed him a small brush. "Of course, buddy. We'd love your help." John watched as the officer patiently showed the boy how to mix colors and make smooth strokes. In that moment, he saw the true power of forgiveness and second chances. The transformation wasn't just in the officers or the community, it was in the hope for a better future that they were all building together. John stood at the entrance of the community center, his heart swelling with pride as he watched people stream in for the event he had organized. The large hall was decorated with colorful banners and posters, each one showcasing the progress they had made in the community over the past few months. "This is amazing, John," Martha said, squeezing her son's arm. "Your father would be so proud." John nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I hope so, Mom. I really hope so." As the hall filled up, John saw familiar faces everywhere. There were the kids from the youth center, dressed in their best clothes and buzzing with excitement. Local business owners chatted with police officers, their once strained relationships now marked by easy smiles and friendly pats on the back. Mayor Santos arrived, shaking hands and beaming at the turnout. "John, my boy," he boomed, "you've done a remarkable thing here. This is what community is all about." John thanked him, feeling both humbled and energized by the mayor's words. He looked around the room, marveling at how far they had come. Officer Davis and Officer Thompson were there too, helping to serve refreshments and chatting easily with attendees who had once viewed them with suspicion. As the event got underway, John took to the small stage at the front of the hall. The room fell silent as he tapped the microphone. "Thank you all for coming," John began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "A few months ago, I stood in a very different place. I was angry, confused, and felt like the world was against me. But today, I stand here filled with hope and gratitude." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "We've all worked hard to get here. We've had difficult conversations, we've faced our fears and prejudices, and we've learned to see each other as human beings first. This is what my father, Reverend James Carter, fought for. He believed in the power of community, in the strength we find when we stand together. As John spoke about his father's legacy and the progress they had made, he saw tears in many eyes, including his mother's. He felt a deep sense of connection to everyone in the room, a shared purpose that transcended their differences. This celebration isn't just about what we've accomplished, John continued. It's about the future we're building together. A future where our children can grow up feeling safe, respected, and full of hope. As John continued his speech, his voice grew stronger, filled with emotion and purpose. He shared his journey of self-discovery, his eyes glistening as he spoke of the father he never knew. I didn't know my father, but I've come to know him through his legacy, John said, his voice wavering slightly. Through the stories of those he helped, through the changes he fought for, I've discovered a part of myself I never knew existed. The room was silent, everyone hanging on John's every word. He spoke of love, justice, and equality, the pillars of his father's work and the foundation of their community's future. My father believed that love could conquer hate, that justice could prevail over injustice, and that we are all equal in our humanity, John continued. These aren't just lofty ideals. They're the building blocks of the community we're creating together. John's gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of Officer Davis and Officer Thompson. Forgiveness isn't easy, he said softly, but it's necessary. It's the bridge that connects us, that allows us to move forward together. Tears were flowing freely now, not just from Martha and the officers, but from many in the audience. John's words touched something deep within them, a shared hope for a better future. We've all made mistakes, John said, his voice strong and clear. We've all felt anger, fear, and distrust, but look at us now. Look at what we've accomplished when we chose to come together, to understand each other, to forgive. John's final words rang out in the hushed room. This is just the beginning. Together we can build a community, a world, where love triumphs over hate, where justice is for all, and where every person is treated with dignity and respect. This is my father's legacy, and it's the future we're creating together. As John finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. People stood, wiping tears from their eyes, deeply moved by John's heartfelt words. His message of love, justice, and unity had resonated with everyone present, touching hearts and inspiring minds. As the applause for John's speech died down, the event transitioned into a special tribute to Reverend James Carter. John and Martha made their way to the front of the room, where a covered plaque waited to be unveiled. The crowd hushed as John and his mother stood side by side, their hands resting on the cloth covering the plaque. Martha's eyes glistened with unshed tears, while John's face was a mix of pride and emotion. Today, we honor a man who dedicated his life to making our community and our world a better place, John began, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. Reverend James Carter, my father, stood for love, justice, and equality. His work touched countless lives, and his legacy continues to inspire us today. Martha nodded, a soft smile on her face as she remembered her late husband. With a gentle tug, they pulled away the cloth, revealing a beautiful bronze plaque. The crowd leaned forward, eager to see the tribute to their beloved community leader. The plaque bore an image of Reverend James Carter, his kind eyes and warm smile captured perfectly in the bronze. Below the image were the words, "In honor of Reverend James Carter, whose unwavering commitment to love, justice, and equality continues to light our path forward." As people read the words, a murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd. Many nodded in agreement, remembering the impact James had made on their lives and the community. John felt a surge of pride as he looked at his father's image. For so long, James had been a mystery to him. But now, seeing the respect and love in the eyes of those gathered, John felt deeply connected to his father's legacy. Martha squeezed John's hand, her voice soft as she spoke to the crowd. James would be so proud of what we've accomplished here. He always believed in the power of community, in the strength we find when we stand together. John nodded, his eyes moving from the plaque to the faces in the crowd. He saw Officer Davis and Officer Thompson, their expressions solemn and respectful. He saw the young people from the youth center, their eyes wide with admiration, and he saw the community leaders nodding in approval. In that moment, John felt the weight of his father's legacy, not as a burden, but as a source of strength and inspiration. He realized that by honoring his father's memory and continuing his work, he had found his own path forward. As the event drew to a close, John stood quietly at the edge of the room, watching as people mingled and chatted. His eyes swept over the diverse crowd, taking in the smiles and the animated conversations. He couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed since that fateful day of his arrest. John's mind drifted back to the moment when the police cars had surrounded him, the fear and confusion he had felt as he was handcuffed and taken away. It seemed like a lifetime ago now. He remembered the shock of learning about his father's identity, the hurt of realizing his mother had kept such a big secret from him. But as he stood there watching the community come together, John felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over him. He realized that without that painful experience, he might never have discovered his true purpose. The arrest had been the catalyst for a journey of self-discovery that had led him to this very moment. John's gaze fell on Officer Davis, who was engaged in a friendly conversation with one of the youth center kids. He smiled, remembering how far they had come in rebuilding trust between the police and the community. The challenges he had faced had opened his eyes to the work that needed to be done, and had given him the courage to step up and make a difference. As he reflected on his journey, John felt a profound sense of growth. He was no longer the man who had been content with his quiet, routine life. He had become someone who was actively working to improve his community, someone who was carrying on his father's legacy in his own unique way. John's mother, Martha, approached him with a warm smile. "You've done your father proud, John," she said softly, squeezing his arm. John nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "Thank you, Mom," he replied. "I'm grateful for everything, even the hard parts. They've made me who I am today." As the community event came to a close, a palpable sense of renewed hope filled the air. People lingered, reluctant to leave the warmth and unity they had experienced. John stood at the center of it all, his heart full of gratitude and purpose. The mayor approached John, a broad smile on her face. "Mr. Carter, what you've accomplished here is truly remarkable," she said, extending her hand. "Your father would be proud." John shook her hand firmly, feeling a mix of emotions. "Thank you, Mayor. It's been a community effort," he replied humbly. As the crowd began to disperse, John, his mother Martha, and several community leaders gathered near the newly unveiled plaque honoring Reverend James Carter. They formed a small circle, their faces etched with determination. "We've made great strides," John began, his voice steady and clear. "But our work is far from over. We must continue to build on this momentum." Martha nodded, her eyes glistening with pride. "Your father always said that change is a journey, not a destination," she added, squeezing John's hand. Officer Davis stepped forward, his face serious. "On behalf of the police department, I want to reaffirm our commitment to working with the community. We've learned so much, and we're dedicated to doing better." One by one, the community leaders spoke up, each pledging their support and resources to continue the work they had started. They talked about expanding youth programs, improving community police relations, and addressing systemic inequalities. As they spoke, John felt a deep sense of connection to everyone around him. He realized that the bonds they had formed through their shared efforts were strong and enduring. These relationships would be the foundation for lasting change in their community. "Together," John said, looking at each person in turn, "we can uphold the values my father fought for: love, justice, and equality. Not just today, but every day moving forward." The group nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting the seriousness of their commitment. They knew the road ahead would not be easy, but they were ready to face the challenges together. The day after the community event, John and Martha decided it was time to visit Reverend James Carter's gravesite. They drove to the peaceful cemetery on the outskirts of town, the car filled with a comfortable silence. As they walked through the rows of headstones, Martha gently guided John to his father's final resting place. John stood before the simple granite headstone, reading the inscription, Reverend James Carter, beloved husband, father, and champion of justice. He felt a lump form in his throat as he carefully placed a bouquet of vibrant flowers at the base of the stone. Taking a deep breath, John spoke softly. "Dad, I wish I had known you, but I want to thank you for the legacy you left behind. Your courage and dedication to making the world a better place have inspired me more than you could ever know." Martha stood beside her son, her eyes brimming with tears. She placed a comforting hand on John's shoulder as he continued. "I promise to carry on your work in my own way. The community you loved is coming together, and I'll do my best to keep that spirit of unity alive." John fell silent for a moment, letting the gentle breeze wash over him. He felt a sense of peace settling in his heart, as if his father's spirit was there with them. Martha squeezed John's hand. "He would be so proud of you, John," she whispered. With a final nod of respect to his father's grave, John turned to his mother. They began to walk away, hand in hand, their steps slow and measured. As they made their way back to the car, John felt a profound sense of closure. The weight of the unknown that had burdened him for so long had lifted, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. John knew that he would continue to carry his father's legacy forward, not just in memory, but through his daily actions and commitment to his community. With each step, he felt more certain of his path, ready to make the world a better place one day at a time. Would you forgive the police officers if you were in John Carter's shoes? Yes or no? Let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to my channel. I am spending hours upon hours writing these heartwarming stories for you, and your support is what keeps me going.